what is perspective? Now, the traditional understanding of perspective, which is what I'm going to start. The first part, the traditional understanding of perspective is of three kinds. The first is a first-person narrator. So these are stories that we heard yesterday. I am blank. I was blank. I felt blank. Right? So they are all person-centric. Most personal storytelling comes from this kind of place. So everything is in I. It could be in the past or the future. Future very rarely, past or present continuous, but all about me. My experience is my version, and so you can look at it through my eyes. This is very, very powerful. This narrator, this kind of storytelling is very powerful to get audiences to connect with you. So even if you're telling a story of somebody else and then you say it in first person, you will immediately have your hook. This is very effective when you work in corporate environments. If you put yourself in the center of the story, you say, this is how this makes me. So like, this is what this budget cut means to the organization. Blah, 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 nobody cares. I think this, whatever. And I frame it as a story for myself and the impact it has on me. And it immediately gets you a connection with the audience. So it is a very powerful way to tell stories in first person. The second person narrator is you. You all have come here today and you are going to go on a journey. Perhaps you're going to use your imagination and you're going to take flight and all become astronauts. And the you narrator is very experimental. When you do storytelling, you will use the you narrator very infrequently, but you can use it very well for emphasis. It can be a great way to invite the audience to reflect, and it's also the best way to ensure your audience is listening when you use a you narrator. Having said that, an entire 10-minute story in a you narration would be exhausting because you're expected to keep up the whole time. It's the sort of language that puts audiences on their toes. And you don't want audiences on their toes the whole time. You want them to be like, okay, and then go back to their lives, right? Like, so that's the effect we're going. So I would say I'm happy if people experiment with you narrators, but I would struggle, I think, personally. But yeah, if anyone's drawn and really feels like this is inspiring, then you should definitely do you stories. The most famous example of you narration in literature is this book by Italo Calvino called If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Could I share an example of you narration? Okay, so you know what I'm going to just do very, very quickly. I'm going to read you a small excerpt from this book. Very famous, very beautiful Italian high literature sort of thing. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's a great read if you can find it in you. I'm going to read you just the first 2 paragraphs because we asked for an example of you narration. You are about to begin reading Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Relax, concentrate, dispel every other thought. Let the world around you fade. Best to close the door. The TV is always on in the next room. Tell the others right away, no, I don't want to watch TV. Raise your voice. They won't hear you otherwise. I'm reading. I don't want to be disturbed. Maybe they haven't heard you with all that racket. Speak louder. Yell, I'm beginning to read Italo Calvino's new novel. Or, if you prefer, don't say anything. Just hope they'll leave you alone. Right? So you have a sense of what the you narrator sounds like here. And for a whole book or for a whole storytelling performance, it would be a lot, I think. But that's just something I haven't explored yet. The third kind is the third person narrator, he, she, them stories. This is a great hit with traditional tales. Once upon a time, there was a king who, he was over there. You have easy answers to third person narrators. Third person narrators can also be omniscient, which means that they can know everything happening parallelly, right? And they don't have to be confined by a perspective. So for example, if I was telling you a story about myself, I might say, oh, I was once in Japan on an interpretation assignment, and my friend, who is deaf, was standing next to me and asking me a question about sushi that I did not know how to answer. Now, I cannot communicate to you simultaneously everything about him and about myself and about the location because I'm telling you only what I saw. So this is the other side of eyes from my eyes, right? Whereas if you look at a third person narrator, there were two people standing in line for sushi. One of them was deaf and one was hearing. The man who was deaf turned to the woman and signed to her, asking, "Is this fish?" Now, do you see what the third person gives us that the first person doesn't? It gives us the idea of being outside. Imagine yourself as a director or a cinematographer or someone who's looking at the story externally. What people love to use third person for is communicating wisdom. And I know that's a weird way to phrase it, but if I look at corporate contexts for where you would use third person, it would be our business has decided to blank. The bosses will continue to look after us, maintain our order. They will ensure whatever. It is a very and this is not there's nothing logical about what I'm going to say next, but there's something very comforting about third person voice. And the reason we find it comforting is perhaps because we are most exposed to third person stories. We're most exposed to third person writing.
What's really more important when you're talking about the perspective and the point of view is whose story you want to tell. Who is the best person to tell this story? Whose is it? And why? And what kind of voice do you want to use? Do you want to use a voice that engages your reader and sounds like someone speaking? If you want to use that kind of voice, then you probably want a first-person narrator. Or do you want a voice that blends into the background, that becomes almost invisible as your reader gets involved in the story? That would be your close third-person narrator, because that way the reader can really focus on the characters and the plot and what's happening, which is why it's used so often in things like contemporary thrillers and crime fiction and that kind of thing. So these are the questions to ask yourself so that you can decide whose story you're telling and how you want to tell it. Another couple of things about point of view that are quite important. Once you've picked a point of view, you should try to stick with it. Now, what I mean by that is not that you can't tell your story using different people and going into different people's heads. You absolutely can do that. But it's really important that you don't confuse your reader. So if you are going to do that, you need to make sure that you don't do it in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of a paragraph. And in fact, the advice goes that the best time to change narrator is either at the end of a section, where you're going to put in a section break and go to the next section. So it's really, really clear that this could be somebody else. And there are lots of cues for the reader to understand that something is changing. Or, even better, to have chapters from one perspective and chapters from another perspective. And if you do that, you might even want to mark up on your chapters whose perspective we are hearing now.
Choosing a point of view. This is the question. First person, second person, third person close, third person omniscient. Which one is best? Talk first person, which is narrative told as I, me, or my. Example, I pick up the phone and say, hello. First person is my favorite point of view, and it's what I write in most, just because, to me, it feels the most personal and intimate. It just makes you feel like you are actually the character, which is something us writers are always trying to accomplish, right? First person, in my opinion, is the most immersive point of view to write in. Second person, narrative told as you and your. Example, you pick up the phone and say, hello. Is second person even worth talking about? Like, does anybody even write in that? Unless you're doing like a choose your own adventure book. Remember those? Those were amazing. I loved those. So I've never actually seen a novel written in second person, but I have read and written some flash fiction written in second person, and it's an interesting style to play with. Another thing you can do is sort of mix in second person with your point of view of choice, which creates kind of a conversation between the character and the reader. Third person is more popular than second person. So even when you're writing from third person, you're still choosing a point of view. With third person close, you are choosing a point of view of one of your characters. Third person close can be ideal for writing a story that's going to follow a lot of characters.